Is Treylon Burks finished? When players don't break out in their first or second year, we don't often see them ever break out. And Treylon Burks is really kind of in that situation. And I don't know if it really matters why it happened. He's dealt with asthma his first year coming in, injuries his second year. It's really always something. But I do think that there's kind of this perception a lot of players who do break out late tend to be lower draft capital players. And these higher end players, somehow, if they don't hit, they just never really get there. And I think we want to just talk a little bit about like why that is, maybe Treylon Burks' situation. Is there any hope for him going anywhere? And really kind of just like the evaluation process when we're looking into these guys, like, looking at a Treylon Burks, can he get right? Like, look at it in context. What's going on there? So, I mean, just initial thoughts. I've kind of word saladed it a little bit. But Jake, what do you kind of think about Treylon Burks in this context?
Yeah, I think you're pretty on point with, an overarching issue in the NFL in terms of overevaluation. There's this weird, nuanced gap that I think happens when players are misevaluated, especially on the higher end. The gap between actual versus reality, actual versus predicted, is significantly larger. So meaning those elite characteristics or those elite traits that teams are seeing at the college level that aren't necessarily landing in the pro game are making that player seem significantly more subpar or potentially even lower caliber than they were perceived at some other point, i.e., why they were drafted when they were. I think the biggest thing that I take away from situations like Treylon Burks, for instance, or Kevin White, for instance, you find yourself wanting to see these elite physical wide receivers, and their physicality was able to brandish them a gap between collegiate level players and pro level players. Here, we're finding that those players don't have those other elite traits, i.e., typically, it's usually the ability to separate. I find that that's usually the biggest one. I also find their elusiveness after the catch is significantly worse. So where they're breaking tackles significantly easier in the college game, they're not able to do it in the pro game. And the last option or the last issue, which is usually a very big one when you're a wide receiver, is hands. So when you're not under as much duress trying to catch and receive a football, because there usually is more separation in the collegiate game, you find yourself in a situation where you're going to not have as many contested catches. Therefore, your ability to receive the ball is at a much higher level. Think about a Quentin Johnston. He had similar issues in college, and they only translate to exactly the same concerns that people had with him in the NFL. And funny enough, I think all three of those wide receivers that I named had similar-ish builds to some extent in the collegiate game that they weren't able to translate into the NFL game. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up some really interesting points there. I mean, obviously the separation issues make sense because the route running isn't nearly as refined as it needs to be coming from the collegiate to the NFL. So yeah, like that all kind of lines up. And I think going back to your point of like misevaluation, right? Like we're saying that when these guys are evaluated, like maybe but I don't even know if a Burks is a good example, but I think more of like a N'Keal Harry. Like the gap is so wide in that evaluation, right? Like they're so much worse than I think than the evaluators lead on. Do we see the same thing going the other way though, right? When we're talking about lower draft capital players, maybe like a Puka, do we think that they are similarly misevaluated, or is that gap a little bit tighter?
I think they're similarly misevaluated. I still find that there are going to be teams that make decisions based off of strength of schedule or strength of conference in which players play, and so you see guys like a Sky Moore ball out at a lower level competition, get overdrafted, and can't perform at the level that we expect them to in the NFL, and then you see the exact opposite where there's almost like, for lack of better words, I think a lot of Puka's tape honestly looks kind of clunky when he plays.
Yeah.
He's a clunky type of
even
receiver.
in the NFL.
Even in the NFL, yeah. And
Yeah.
so when a lot of scouts see players like him and they compare him to almost like a Tyquan Thornton, right? Tyquan at Baylor, incredibly electric. It's all the exciting things you want. These NFL scouts are just like you and I. They like the things that excite them. They don't understand that there's inherent risk with the excitement. And a guy like Puka, who, even though he has all of the other characteristics, i.e., incredible hands, i.e., ability to separate, i.e., ability to catch in congestion, in traffic, those are things you can't take away from players, and you don't get to see them. And I think my biggest concern when, especially, we're trying to review tape, when we're trying to analyze the next upcoming rookie class, we're in that process right now, right, is too much of these electric players who have so much gap. Going back to the initial point of this conversation, or to one of the initial points that I made, I think when players create too much separation at the collegiate level, it's also an issue. You don't really get to understand them in the same situations that they'll kind of be experiencing in the NFL. Think of Kadarius Toney, for instance. We only got to see him 1 year in college because of his positional changes that he made, but people brandished him as this electric player that creates so much separation. His separation, he was actually able to gain relatively decently in the NFL. He has incredible feet, but you find himself, when under any type of duress, the dude has brick hands, right? Like he no joke caused 2 pick sixes in the last year, and I find that,
Fumbles,
yeah,
it's security issues and reliability issues in general.
exactly. But he's a prime example of another first rounder who will probably find himself not really used much in the NFL. Some of those things are off the field clubhouse issues, but I do think that there's a correlation between, over evaluation of these guys causes teams to realize that the gap between the playing ability for these quote unquote elite traits that they have don't
Mhm.
necessarily translate into the NFL game, and therefore they don't really have a purpose or a place in most teams anymore.
It's interesting. This isn't one to one, but I saw and retweeted this tweet from Jetpack Galileo, great film guy, talking about how the NFL has a QB evaluation problem. Right? They don't know, first of all, how to properly evaluate them. They don't know how to fix them either. There's not enough good coaches or coaches who are well versed in all facets of the game to make them co-coordinators, which is what they need to be. Right? And I'm definitely taking a little bit of a leap here, but you see guys like Cooper Kupp who are almost like a coordinator on the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think in general, cross positionally, there is a talent development issue in the league. And I'm not saying we're better at it. Like, obviously, we don't have the skills to develop a guy or anything like that. Maybe we have some skills to identify things, but that's just a fact, and it's contributing to this in general. But getting back to kind of what we were talking about, I'm not sure that like the DC itself, the draft capital itself, correlates as much with the hit rate when not producing. I'm wondering if like the lower DC guys, when they're misevaluated and once they're found, they do produce. It's like, oh, here's this guy, like let's get him some work now. Where that kind of, we found something, you know, I guess the shine kind of rubs off with the first round pick. If he doesn't do what he's supposed to do year one, you're not going to have that same fuzzy feeling when he has a mediocre turnaround or anything. Like if you see one of these lower DC guys do almost anything, you're like, whoa, let's get going here. And I think the coaches kind of may react similarly to that. So I think just psychologically, whether it's intentional, subconscious, whatever, like I do think that may be part of it. There's one other point I want to make too, and I did kind of allude to this where I was like, well, I don't know about Treylon Burks. I liken this more to N'Keal Harry, and I'm thinking, what if Burks is actually good, right? Like I think he can get left behind with this situation because it's so bad. They keep adding pieces. Like we're talking about him because Ridley just got added there, right? He's already established. Now we've created this perfect storm. The market value dips, both in the NFL and in Dynasty, if we want to talk that way, but definitely, in the NFL. And the idea that they should just earn the work because they were this first round pick goes out the window. So even if he goes and gets another opportunity somewhere, we were talking about the Jets, but we find out Mike Williams is there now, so that's gone really. But is there another situation like that he could find himself in? Does it even matter? Because has the perception deteriorated to such a level that it doesn't matter what he does unless he went somewhere and was just an absolute dominant stud, right? And I think that plays a factor. And I think that might be kind of where we're at on Treylon Burks, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the last thing I would like to say is with regards to that window
Mhm.
for him, right? You're talking about
Mhm.
most likely a GM or head coach that was scouting him or viewing his tape from collegiate days to wanting to translate that into the NFL now 3 years later versus what they've seen from him over the last 2 years. I think for a lot of GMs, they're not really willing to make that risk given the fact that, he's
Right.
still a first rounder on a first round contract and having to pay that contract when they can basically draft probably a similar player in fourth, fifth round, in their opinion, regardless of pedigree.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the mentality. You're seeing it right now in the NFL, completely different position, but in quarterback with Justin Fields. Doesn't matter what the pedigree is, or even Trey Lance. Like these are guys who have draft capital, but most teams aren't willing to give up much for them. So you put
Mhm.
yourself in these situations because they have to pay out the remainder of these first round rookie contracts, and they put themselves in situations where they basically the next chance that they get is probably after this contract elapses, and then they'll maybe get one more shot in the NFL, if that. So I would say Treylon Burks' next chance is probably after this year if they sever ties, and then he might get himself a 1 year window, get himself a chance. Who knows? He might even be a practice squad player. For sake, excuse my language, but like it could be literally that bad. And that's so sad. It really is because I do think that his player profile was incredibly exciting coming into the program.
Yeah, and we just pulled up the graphic here. He's 23 years old, man, just 23, but that 1.28 career yards per out run is abysmal. I mean, that has to be like in the 1.6 range to even be like baseline.
Yeah.
So it's been really bad for him. We have him 168, wide receiver 68, KTC 195, wide receiver 72, ADP 173, wide receiver 59. So we're lower on the wide receiver end than ADP. We're right about there with market in terms of KTC and right in between the two. He might fall for us, honestly, a little bit more. I think it's probably going to happen. I just, it's unfortunate. I really don't see it coming together for the young man. And I actually like the player, and I think that he does have some talent, and he may have been slightly misevaluated, but I think that it's just been a perfect storm, like I mentioned, and just a terrible situation that's deteriorated to a point of probably no return. Like you said, if his best option is a year or two from now, I mean that's too far, especially
Yeah.
for our purposes in terms of trying to find a top 12, top 24 hit. That's very unlikely here with a guy like Treylon Burks. So awesome. I think that's a good discussion, especially with Calvin Ridley signing. I want to thank you, Jake, for joining me as always. That was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Thanks, guys, for joining. Please subscribe and stay tuned for more.